Hello everybody. Hi. I hope you're having a good time. This is me first time moderating a session. Please be kind. I'll just pass on the mic to the panelists to introduce themselves and then we'll get on with the discussion.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I already introduced myself, so not much of an introduction is required. I'm Aditya, president of AKT Health. We've started in Japan, and then, I'll just keep it very short because I just introduced myself in a couple of minutes time. So.
Excellent. So, good evening, everyone. I'm Tony McDermott. Adriano stole my line. I was going to ask you, how many of you have heard about digital health? You can raise your hands. Great, we have 3 people. How many people have heard of prescription digital therapeutics? All right. I was hoping there would be 0. I work for a company called Click Therapeutics. I am the VP for Global Commercial Strategy. We are a developer of software as a medical device. And so we work with pharmaceutical companies. We recently had an approval with Otsuka, a major depressive disorder, for a product called Rejoin. We're also in clinical development with companies such as Boehringer Ingelheim and Indivior for different assets in different therapeutic areas.
Okay, I already introduced myself. Director of Evidence, Market Research, and Clinical Trial Operations at CS.
Hello, my name is Nicolás Encina. My career has been all over the place, and I'm kind of all over the place right now, so bear with me. I started the Human Genome Project and spent most of my career right here in Kendall Square, starting biotech and pharma companies and software companies. And then ultimately ended up in PerkinElmer for an acquisition where I led innovation there, became VP of Innovation, and then launched your largest software suite, ML, AI-based. This was a year back. Right around that time, I got scooped over to the Logwood Medical Center area, where I've been now for about 7 years, where I was pulled over there by Dr. Tallapragada to help start an innovation lab out of Brigham and Women at Harvard School of Public Health called RAM Labs. I was Chief Science and Technology Officer for a few years before starting a new program on precision medicine, which I help run right now. And then in parallel to that, I'm also co-founder and executive director of an international consortium on nuclear sequencing, and then also involved with a startup doing a lot of big data analytics and precision medicine for maternal care.
Thank you so much for all the introductions. I think we're all very happy that you took the time to be here. So to begin a panel discussion, I have my first question for you, Tony. You work with a lot of data sets. Adriano just mentioned you're generating tons and tons of data. So you work with a lot of data that's generated from experiments on the clinician side. How do you leverage this data to make decisions on the commercial side of your product, or in general, if you could put some insights on how we can use this data to, commercialize our products?
Yeah, so I'll just give a little bit of background for where I've come and why I'm here right now. So I have about 20 years of experience prior to coming to Click, mostly on the consulting side and the pharma side. One of the things that we saw on the pharma side is data is, products are stagnant, right? And so what we do within Click, and one of the reasons that I moved to the digital space, and one of the reasons I'm working with Adriano and the CS team is we can continually learn and iterate our products as we move through development. So within Click, we have a multi-phased approach when it comes to developing products, where we start with the user and user research to formulate just the background thesis of the product. What we'll do then is we'll iterate over time, and we'll do learning studies, we'll do RCTs, real-world evidence, and then post-market studies to continually to refine that product. So, when a product is cleared on the digital side, it is essentially cleared at that point in that version. We will constantly be iterating and doing different versions to make sure that product moves to where that patient is. So for us, data is incredibly relevant to make sure that our product is as cutting edge as possible. And so a learning study that we just completed with Adriano's team is making sure that we understand not just the data for that patient, but also what the HCP or the clinician cares about, because we need to make sure that we're meeting them with where they're at when it comes to care for particular conditions like schizophrenia.
That's a wonderful one. So next question is to Adriano. So there is a lot of market trends that we see in the decentralized clinical trial space. How do you approach this data integration, and how do you approach the evidence generation to accelerate healthcare innovation?
Yeah, I think the way I respond to that is to, if I can use the example that you just mentioned, is when we're in the planning phase and we work with the team to see what are the proof points that we want to make for the product. If there's a commercial value story, if there's an HCP value story that we need to produce, right? If there are certain patient needs that we need to address, we want to make sure that we clearly identify what's the source of that data, what are the sites or what are the partners where we can gather that data from, and how can we decentralize that process in a way that that design is as efficient as it can be for selecting the sites, right? Selecting, identifying the patients, enrolling the patients, and then what is the ease of data collection throughout the study, right? So it really starts with those hypotheses, those value stories, and that then drives the design of the study itself.
Wonderful. Next question is for Aditya. So, Aditya, you have a lot of people don't know he's also a blockchain expert. AKT Health works with a lot of blockchain products. We're in fact even developing our own. So, I would request you to first educate the audience on what blockchain is. Not a lot of people know it, and where do you see its maximum implementation in the healthcare space currently, or in the clinical trial space?
Yeah, I think from a commercial standpoint, blockchain doesn't make so much of a sense. But when we first started to implement new technologies, the first project that we did was on the supply chain management, and where we tracked the complete supply chain of a clinical trial. That's where we initially implemented our first blockchain use case. And the next use case where we starting to implement our is into the data collection, remote patient monitoring side. But actually, to be very frank, we are not really speaking to our clients about what technology it is, why it's important, but rather we are just using it as a base where we get a lot of data from the sensors. We work with multiple sensors, and then we are also building our own sensor as well, which collects heart rate, respiratory rate, and temperature. With these three data points, actually, you could do a lot on the patient. So we thought, okay, having this kind of sensitive data from a patient, it's good if we have it's more secure servers. So that's where we started to implement blockchain, where we collect the data from a lot of devices these days, and then we want to make sure that this data is protected in a right way. And then obviously the entire process doesn't end there. We collect the data from the IoT devices, we put it back to the blockchain. But the biggest challenge of having entire data in blockchain is it doesn't make any sense for us to put the heavy data like imaging data or videos that for the surgeries, that we still put it on our normal cloud servers so that it's easily accessible, so that we can easily access this data to create language models right now. I think you gave a very good picture for us and the kind of data that we are collecting. The EMR data, the patient-reported outcome data. There's tons and tons of data, and then we are not sure how we are losing the data through cybersecurity attacks and all this stuff. That's the reason why we wanted to have that piece, missing piece in the healthcare, where you secure the data in a more better way, especially when you're dealing with the patients directly. That's one of the areas that we have been trying to implement. It's very tough to actually convince people why it is important, but I think we are not really trying to tell the importance of technology. Rather, we just implementing on the back end.
Thank you for that. So we moved a bit to blockchain because we just wanted the audience to know. we will go back to data sets. The question is for Nicolás. How have you seen integration of social determinants of health data revolutionize approach to product development and validation in the healthcare industry, particularly in addressing disparities in access and healthcare outcomes?
So, I mean, I see it all over the place. You know, I'm involved, like I said, with one startup. We do a lot of work with precision medicine broadly, so more than genomics, it's social determinants, behavioral, environmental, and clinical, obviously. And so, you know, there we do a lot of work in looking at what causes for maternal morbidity, mortality, which are beyond just clinical. You know, in fact, a lot of these things are determined outside the clinic, and so a lot of them are actually influenced by social factors, access to good quality care, good nutrition, environmental factors, whether it be pollutants in the air, the water, and so on. So I see it a lot in that space. But I think you know, social determinants are becoming more evident, even if you go back to the genomics world. I mean, I was part of the Human Genome Project, and there where we were doing the early discovery, you know, 20-some odd years ago, we thought that once we coded the human genome, we'd crack the code and all disease would be known and we'd solve it all, right? And then over time we realized that it's far more complex than that, and so many diseases are more than Mendelian in nature. You know, they're either multi-gene, so you look at polygenic risk scores, and in a lot of cases that only gives you a probability score that then you have to factor in other things like your behavior, your environment, things you're exposed to, and so on. And so I would say that there's a big shift towards looking at social determinants in product development, from things that are very acutely focused on certain diseases to genomics broadly. And there are a lot of papers showing that, you know, and having conversations around what factors more into your health outcomes and your health costs. Is it your genetic code or is it your zip code? And so there's a lot of discussion on that space because we're learning it's not as simple as one gene, one mutation, one disease. It's fairly complex, and social factors have to be accounted for that.
That's something very interesting, very new for us. Next question is for Adriano.
Just to add to this point, so one of the observations that we had in one of our recent studies is that the patients that have a varying degree around you know, level of education, past experiences, economic status, they respond very differently to the therapeutic, right? And while we didn't design the drug experience or the device experience with that in mind, to target patients and to optimize what the care experience would be for them, we are kind of doing that in research, in reverse, right? We find that the way they respond to treatment, the way they engage, their levels of engagement is very different if we start looking at social determinants of health. So I think we are becoming more and more alert on that and taking notes, and you know, the upcoming studies, we will be targeting or personalizing more the experience around how we design the protocol, what are kind of the endpoints, expected endpoints, to account for this variability related with this social determinants of health.
I think even we see a lot of the diseases which are through the quality of life. I think social determinants they have very huge impact, especially like, you know, we saw a lot of similar products like therapeutics, which are most targeting the people on smoking area. And then most of the data that we collect, or the regulatory body which is asking us to collect, is mostly on the social impact that disease can create on the study.
So Adriano, we've been talking a lot about real world data capture, and we're collecting a lot of data. There are traditional ways of collecting data, and then there are the modern ways of collecting data through devices, through smart devices like your organization does. What challenges do you see in merging these data sets and making sense of these such that they can benefit product development and outcomes as such?
Well, It's complex, but it's possible, right? So especially in this real world pragmatic type of studies, it's again identifying the right use cases. What is the best data to be collected? The challenges that we have is not so much accessing to the data, is to make sure that the data that comes in is of high quality. So an example is for a certain data element, if there are 3 or 4 or 5 data brokers, these data brokers have a varying degree of quality on their data. So for the same patient, for the same data set, one might have 90% completion on that data set and with acceptable levels of quality. And for the same patient with a different data provider, we will find a 30% completion, right? So as we start working more and more with these different data providers, and we now have great experience with, probably we know 90% of the data providers. We have bad experiences and better experiences as we mature, as we develop experience with them. But the challenge is still on the quality and completeness of the data and the varying degree across the different data sources and data providers.
So Tony, on similar lines, there is again like real world data capture happening, but there is also inputs that come from the healthcare provider. How do you think this the data coming from real world sources and inputs coming in from healthcare provider be integrated to improve your product such that it becomes useful and beneficial for patients and the healthcare providers?
Yeah, there's a couple of different ways we take a look at it. So within Click, we could take this manifestation product as an example, and that was developed through a different FDA pathway. Candidly, it was like around the time of COVID as well, so we know it was like the Wild West of clinical trials at that point. But through that process, what we saw was there was a couple pieces of data that we needed to pull together to make sure that the experience was relevant for HCPs. And so, not only were we capturing patient-level data, we were also capturing more PROs certainly from a patient, right, but through the eyes of the HCP, so that they were able to understand, number one, if that patient was dispensed one course of therapy, were they fine? Were they able to achieve smoking cessation through one course of therapy? Or were they appropriate for a refill? And so, we could take hard-coded data to get to that. What we found personally was PRO data was probably a better way to do it because it gave that real-world experience to the HCP. It gave us more qualitative data when we would have more quant data, and it also reduced the amount of data capture that we needed to store on our side, right? And so I think that combination of the data was good from an HCP perspective. And I mentioned a little bit earlier, when we take a look at some of the HCP journey work, we do want to make sure that the data that we're capturing and how we're iterating the product fits within the ways that HCP wants to treat that patient, right? So we need to make sure that we're meeting the HCP with where they're at. So that's some of the ways that we've kind of approached it from a clinical perspective.
Aditya, any inputs that you want to put in the space?
Actually, I have questions rather than inputs. Because the challenge is when we are collecting a lot of data through multiple sources. Obviously, what kind of questions that you hear from regulatory bodies in terms of how we collect the data, how we process the data? Are there any rules that are changing recently? Because we don't have that experience. Because we did a very faced a class 2 medical device, software as a medical device. So it was not really tough because we haven't started collecting a lot of data. But once you go through other classes, and then once you start collecting a lot of data from the sensors, the sensors could actually just stay on a cycle and then it could still give a lot. So what do you have any experience in terms of what these FDA bodies ask you guys in terms of the quality of the data that's coming into the trial?
Anyone can answer.
So I can start and I can take it from two angles, the FDA, and then I want to talk about the patient voice here. So from an FDA perspective, they need to ensure that we're storing it in a compliant way, and the way that we're taking a look at analyzing the data is up to their standards. So what we do personally is we'll iterate with them and make sure that they're clear on the ways that we're capturing data, how we're storing it, and if there's feedback that they want to provide to us, that's happening on the fly. We will not just action it in one program, we'll action it across programs. One of the things I want to talk about, and I'll turn it over to you, is the role of the patient. With us working in software as a medical device where it's on your iPhone or your Android, you constantly have access to that phone, right? And not only the phone, but the camera, right? And so we're constantly having to talk to patients about how we're using the data, how it's stored, and that's even been heightened with all of the breach that's recently happened with Change. And so, for us, we're trying to figure out a way to make sure that we're communicating the ways that we're storing data is compliant in a way that you would see for financial services, but boil it down to a patient level where levels of healthcare acuity and digital acuity are going to differ from one patient to the next, especially in those areas that we look at, like depression, schizophrenia, and migraine. You have people that are at different levels of comprehension, and the goal here is to make sure that we're addressing anxieties and that they understand that what we're doing with their data is something that's in the best interest of them, and it's only between them, the HCP, and wherever else they want to share it for consents. And so I just want to make sure that notice was coming out.
Just a quick point on the FDA. I was 2 weeks ago at eSport, Health Economics and Outcomes Research conference, and I was on a panel with some folks of the FDA. And the question came up around people asking what is the blueprint, what's the type of studies, the type of data that will deem acceptable to validate the product. And the answer was clear. We don't have a blueprint, right? We are calling on manufacturers that are closer to these novel data types, right? And they are calling manufacturers to propose study designs, bringing new data, explain the scientific rationale, improving safety and efficacy, improving safety and efficacy of the product. And they recently founded a new group within FDA called C3TI, look them up. And it's all about these topics, right? Novel data types, designing new new types of studies, and touching on all of these questions, right? Access to data, will they deem that the process of access to data is within regulation, right? And then explaining there's a plethora of new use cases that this data can bring to life that the FDA just doesn't know about. But they are open to mold and adapt their thinking if we can prove them that that's the right way to do it.
I think I should add one point. When you're collecting data, especially through multiple sources, in a decentralized evidence generation slide that you were talking, ePros, sensors, and all those things. I think what I thought was maybe if you could tag all this data where it's coming from when you submit to the FDA, would help a lot more better in doing analyzing in the future. That's what I was thinking, because there's so many different sources of data that's coming in a single trial.
Yeah, but from a product standpoint, when you get in front of the FDA, there's something called a design history file, right? That it shows exactly sources of data, how it's processed. If there's an algorithm computing on that data, where does it happen? Is that in a safe environment, regulated environment, and what are the outputs of that? So that is actually a core piece of discussion with the FDA when you get in front of them, right?
Yeah, thank you.
So talking about data, Nicholas, do you have any examples of any initiatives that have utilized the data from the social determinants of that data that has helped marginalized communities?
Yeah, so we're doing work right now with opioid pregnancy. So pregnancies affected by the opioid, and you know, a lot of municipalities have also received some funding from the litigation that happened with the companies involved with that. And so now they're looking at how do they use this money to try to help these families that have been affected by that. And so we do work in not only identifying families that's with the centers that have been affected, but also trying to identify needs that they may have. You know, these families often have needs with nutrition, transportation, housing, and they don't know what the resources are. Many times also they don't speak English. And so trying to translate clinical information, medical information, health information into a language they can understand, identifying the needs, point them to the right resources. And so effectively creating like a safety net around them of resources, facilities, and so on that they have access to, so that you can bring the help to them that they wouldn't otherwise be able to find for themselves. And so a lot of that involves, it's hyper-local information. A lot of it comes from Census Bureau, CDC, EPA, FBI data, and then also scouring the web for resources in the person's environment. And it's particularly difficult too. I mean, some moms live in maternal care deserts. And so then what do you do for them? And so there you really have to start getting clever about what resources you point them to. In many cases they have transportation issues. How do you get them to the resources, or vice versa, resources to them? And so that's where social determinants come in, and that's an area that we're working on actively.
Yeah, just to add, Nicholas, I like that you brought up the opioid example, because in the collaboration that we're taking a look at right now within Divier, we were trying to understand, is there the opportunity for digital to break down some of those social determinants of health? We commonly hear transportation issues are a concern. Stigma and bias is a big concern as well. So by having the digital asset there, maybe sitting alongside or in place of traditional pharmacotherapy, maybe it keeps more people within therapy. And we are studying all this through randomized clinical trials in public domain. But the goal here is to figure out, is there a way to bridge some of that when it comes to logistics? Also when it comes to location, right? So to your point, there is a shortage of providers. Burnout rate is huge right now, and especially in more rural areas. So by addressing the digital area and bridging that gap, in our theory, you can get more patients into care and improve quality of life in those areas. So I appreciate you brought that example specifically.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Nicholas. I think that input was really nice for us to learn about. So we're almost coming at the end of the panel discussion. Any last words, anyone, before we close? Anything to conclude? Okay. I think we've had some really deep discussions. We will get into the Q&A round.
Thank you. Regarding the social determinants, one of the questions that I have is, if you're running a global clinical trial, you would have randomization hypothetically taking care of a lot of differences or the impact that would have social determinants would have on clinical endpoints. Is that something that is an understood aspect, or we don't have an understanding right now how social determinants within a global clinical trial where there's so much variation are actually impacting clinical endpoints?
Thanks for you. Oh yeah. I believe it to you.
Well, I haven't run global clinical trials, so they tend to be more focused on certain demographics within the U.S. A lot of the work that I've done. Ariadne has done global clinical trials, but they weren't really focused on the social determinants. They were more focused on delivery of care in hyper-rural areas in India and Africa and so on. And so we didn't really engage in the social determinants on that side. And like I said, most of the work that I do tends to be more hyper-local because we do look for resources in that area. So how do we help certain demographics, certain people, certain neighborhoods? And a lot of the work right now is really focused on Massachusetts.
Okay. And one more question on the digital health. So with prescription therapeutics, the major issue we're facing which I would like to get your opinion, is the reimbursement aspect. And there's still no clear reimbursement pathways offered by the payers, regardless of whatever the device you have, even if you have FDA cleared. So a lot of companies are now moving from a prescription model, which is a heavy cost model, to an OTC model. And some are started with prescription and now moving towards hybrid model. I would like to get your thoughts on that in terms of, have the payer pathways improved? And second, is there room for sticking to prescription model or a hybrid model, or move totally to over-the-counter model?
So that is a multi-level question, and I'll address all of them. The first thing when it comes to business model with the OTC market, I would disagree and say that that's not really a sustainable market. We've recently seen companies such as Achilles that have gone the OTC route. They've recently announced some strategic changes that are happening. But what I will say is it did make a lot of sense in their case. If you take an area like ADHD, it's not very price sensitive when it comes to parents funding care for their child, especially if they don't want their child to be on stimulants. So I think that is definitely a market where you could go OTC. In the areas that we play in, whether it's depression, schizophrenia, migraine, opioid use, it's not really a viable pathway because you do need the care of an HCP and you do need their awareness of background therapy, right? So when it comes to digital reimbursement barriers, what we're seeing right now is kind of a two-phase approach. Payers are saying they want to see data, right, and validated data. And so I would argue the companies that came before us, and I'm not saying Click is a trailblazer, right, but we're following a pathway that we're seeing that needs to play out. There needs to be more robust data that's out there, right? So the backbone of what we do as a company is strong, placebo-controlled, so double-blinded clinical trials to make sure that we're building that evidence. And because there's no barrier to safety in the eyes of the FDA, we can do more prospective real-world-like studies prior to FDA clearance, right? And so what we're doing is trying to build up that evidence base because whether it's fair or not, payers are holding us to a higher standard of evidence, and so we're trying to meet them there. So our goal is having that drive some reimbursement issues. The other thing that we're taking a look at is state Medicaid levels. While Medicaid is not progressive, they are progressive when it comes to digital therapeutics. So we see that they are early adopters there, and so that's one area where we've seen a clearer pathway. The last thing that we're taking a look at, and will be in DC in about 2 weeks, is trying to lobby for a Medicare bill, which is the access to PDT bill. What this will do is provide a pathway for coverage within Medicare, and it will also help to provide a clear path for reimbursement from an HCP perspective, whether it's through physiological monitoring or therapeutic monitoring. And that's going to be key in making sure that we can embed more of these products into more of the daily life of these patients.
What are the chances for that bill passing?
Slim and none at this point. And the reason I say that is because we are at this point in more of a lame duck type area, right? Nothing ever happens in the presidency. I think our goal and the goal of the Digital Therapeutics Alliance, which is who we'll be in DC with, is trying to get that legislation folded into another regulatory vehicle. There will be elements of that that are going to be adopted, and the good thing is we're starting to see payers take a more concerted view into coverage for digital. In the past it was, well, it's a device, we'll throw it through the DME benefit. We're seeing now that they're saying, well, you know, with a product that sits on a smartphone, the smartphone isn't essentially a medical product, so DME doesn't fit, and they're starting to consider whether it's more pharmacy or medical benefit. So those discussions are materializing. Our goal is, as we get more products in clinical trials, we show that background, plus we get clearance, we're able to change that. It's not going to happen overnight, but my bet is that it will happen, otherwise it wouldn't be a click.
Great answer, thank you.
For sure.
My name is Rebecca Nixon. Tony, thank you for leading the way on getting reimbursement sort of figured out in terms of what category. I'm former Flatiron Health. I headed up our research unit and our strategic affairs. And the topic I wanted to hear your thoughts about for the time frame actually answers your question, which is around the social determinants of health and really can randomized trials actually take care of it. And really the FDA has answered no. So the new diversity plans that actually have legislative backing require a diversity plan to be submitted with all registrational trials because there's so many biases in those who actually enroll. Part of the topics that have been discussed here in terms of transportation and clinical trial deserts.
Even if you suffice with diversity, when you're dealing with a global trial, you're already, even if the racial mix is still the same, you throw in so much variation on social determinants because the social environment in the US is going to be very different than what's going to be in Brazil.
Exactly.
And good luck adjusting that in any kind of a regression model. So what
So
we
the
need,
US FDA cares about the US, for
What-
better or for worse.
what I think what
And
we,
one of the questions really is can patients from Argentina count as Hispanic patients? Can patients from Africa count as Black patients? And those are questions the FDA hasn't answered yet, and a lot of the large pharma companies, and maybe Click too, I see you nodding, are wrestling with that. And the FDA is open to those discussions from a scientific perspective, if they matter or not.
I think what we need is, and to answer, we need some predictive models in terms of how these different variables, social determinants, can actually impact health outcomes. And then in a clinical trial, you can have the standard trial data and standard trial analysis, and then you basically throw an adjuster into it to say, hey, if you adjust all of these, this is what the results come out. We just don't have any we have all the covariates, what we don't have is the regression outputs of those. And that's the problem that we have at this point. How do we address all the variation in a trial if it's a global trial? If it's a local trial, then it's fine, and global it becomes complex.
And I think to bring it back to the panel's conversation about real-world data, which is where I think, personally, coming from Flatiron, real-world data will have a real advantage, both in terms of planning for the trials, and then when they don't meet diversity plan goals, how you deal with it afterwards. And I think both of those you can really get into the predictive models to understand, okay, for multiple myeloma, 30% of your patients is Black. What other types of social determinants of health do we need? Do we need to have 30% of our trial to be Black patients? My goodness, that seemed to have joined the panel. But I wanted your perspectives on diversity plans, real-world data, and in particular, getting teams to think about it earlier. I hear the call here to think about real-world data earlier. Can we get pharma and med tech to think about diversity plans, likely using real-world data earlier?
Yeah, it's site and country selection. There's a start. That's it. Site and country selection.
So we have one last question.
I didn't do that. I also probably don't need a mic. I'm pretty loud. So first, I wanted to thank you guys for having us at Rashmi. You crushed it. First moderation, you did a great job. Adriano, my question is for you, but I invite everybody to answer it. So I saw your slide about the 13% CAGR for DCTs. I've seen that data a couple of times. I definitely think your slide is the most honest. I think that that's pretty close to the overall growth in clinical trials that we've seen in that period of time. And my question is, what is the inflection point that we're waiting for broader adoption of DCTs? Multi-part question, answer it however you want.
Yeah, I think real quick, when it comes to the digital side, I think DCTs are the way to go. The reason for that is because of the diversity and being able to hit multiple populations across the US, and the biggest thing from a digital perspective is cost. Right?
I don't need any more arguments for it.
That is it.
I support it,
yeah.
but yet the growth is super far. Yeah. And why?
Well, actually, I would like to differ, and maybe I can follow up with you. But the last point is that I made on that slide is the data there was up to 2022, and I already have the following years, and the market is actually picking up to COVID times.
Yeah.
So actually surpassed COVID times. So if you see the types of studies now, and you just go to DigitalTrials.com and you can do that analysis yourself, but I've done it, so I can share it with you. and you'll see that it's only going to grow more, right? So, and as we start addressing this disparities between patient types, different geographies, social determinants of health, you will find study designs that will have 3 patients in one site or in one geography, 1 patient here, 2 patients there, especially true in rare diseases. So you can't start, you know, for a company that doesn't have gazillions of dollars to invest in research. If the research requires to recruit, let's say, 20 patients across 20 sites, that doesn't make it feasible, right? So, and DCT is the only way to go.
Cool, thank you.
Okay, last question.
Yeah. Hi, I don't know this. So I'm a regulatory affairs student, so I have this doubt. There will be obviously the audits and inspections going on to make sure that all the supply chain, clinical trials, and all the processes taken in the compliance with the regulations. So the question comes to the Andrew. So my doubt is, you mentioned there are two ways, like traditional and digital ways of data management, right? So what measures, like your company does, like, take to make sure that the same data integrity is being maintained when compared to the traditional and the digital way of data management? Because we have to make sure that we are exhibiting all the proof of evidence when we are doing like regulatory filings and all. You need to show that we are doing all the things in the compliance, all the data management and all. Like, what measures to take when it comes to digital handling of data?
The way I would address it is that, you know, the quality standards and regulations around data safety, right, and security are pretty well established. So any data from a clinical trial has to be governed by a quality management system. All the systems that you bring into the data management layer have to be clinical validation systems. So all of that is pretty well established, right? So data coming from any source have to run through a clinical validated system within a QMS, and I think that's all protocolized, and there's no real challenges there because the blueprint is there in terms of how the data needs to come in, how the data needs to go out, and the levels of traceability that we have to provide in case of an audit.